This is podcast 4 of Unit 13, which provides an idea of what to look out for and what to particularly pay attention to while you're going through the readings for Unit 13 by providing a brief summary of key points. There's a lot of total text between the 4 readings, but I'd advise not skipping any of the readings entirely. If pressed for time, I would suggest reading parts of them, especially introduction and conclusion, and the graphs to gain an idea of the main points. So in terms of the first reading, the Human Security Report 2005 Part 2, the Human Security Audit, this is about 40 pages long, or it appears to be about 40 pages long, but when you take out the notes, photos, graphs, it's under 30, more manageable. Anyway, the data issues it mentions in relation to fatalities I think are important about how difficult it is to collect and be sure of data on fatalities in war. What we think we know about deaths in war may not actually be true. States don't collect such information. They don't want information to be public about that, deaths and tortures that they may have committed, for example. And it's difficult to collect information like that during a conflict. There's also a problem of how to determine if a conflict led to a death. For example, if somebody died of starvation or a disease, to what extent was that related to an armed conflict or not? There's also an issue of categorizing conflicts. A conflict could be state-based. It could be a non-state armed conflict with no state a party, two rebel groups, for example, fighting each other. There's also the issue of what's known as one-sided violence, which is deliberate slaughter of innocent people that's unopposed. For example, like a genocide, or what might be called a politicide, where a genocide occurs against people of certain political beliefs. Many public statements on conflict deaths are just guesses by the media, governments, non-governmental organizations. But one of the outcomes of the report is that civilian fatalities from conflict are probably about 30 to 60% of all deaths in conflict. The figure of about 90% of deaths being civilians is probably a myth. Just briefly, something on that first reading beyond battle deaths that it's mentioned in the report is the number of total deaths through conflict. It's estimated that maybe 85 to 95% of total deaths from conflict are actually what are known as societal deaths. Not directly people dying from conflict, but people dying as a consequence of the war from disease and malnutrition, for example. And all these figures of deaths drop after the Cold War, suggesting that the Cold War fueled most casualties after the end of decolonization. So, as mentioned in a previous unit, the Cold War was not so cold at all for most people in the world. On to the second reading, the Human Security Report 2012, Chapter 8, Deadly Assaults on Civilians. The main thing I want to mention here is about the issue of one-sided violence. As I mentioned, attacks on civilians that are unopposed. This is a more inclusive term than terrorism or genocide, as it includes large-scale massacres and small-scale campaigns. It has a threshold of only 25 deaths per year to be considered a one-sided act of violence. It can be perpetrated by governments or by non-state actors. The target is unarmed civilians. For example, in Libya and Syria in the early days of the conflict there, at the beginning of the Arab Spring, both governments attacked unarmed civilians in large numbers. One-sided violence is distinct from what's known as collateral damage. Collateral damage is legal under international humanitarian law. It's unintended deaths, civilian deaths from conflict, whereas one-sided violence is intentional targeting of civilians, not an unintended byproduct of war. Collateral damage is only illegal if disproportionate or indiscriminate force was used. There's been a trend in the post-Cold War period where for most deaths to occur in only a few situations, mostly civil wars. By far the worst was the 1994 Rwandan genocide, and then in 1996 attacks in Congo. Then again attacks in Congo between 2007 and 2009. In the 2000s as a whole, in that decade, 70% of the deaths were caused by non-state actors. So I'll move on now to the third reading, the Geneva Conventions of 1949 by Spoeri. What it mentions is that the Geneva Conventions, the ones that we are talking about here, were created in 1949 in the wake of unprecedented devastation in World War II to prisoners of war and civilians, millions of people killed unlawfully. But the work on the Geneva Convention started earlier, especially the first to third Geneva Conventions, which were proposed by the International Committee of the Red Cross and were created between 1864 and 1929. These protected land forces that were wounded, naval wounded, and prisoners of war. When we talk about the Geneva Conventions, this refers to 1949, and it refers to these three previous conventions, plus the addition of the fourth, created in that year, 1949. That fourth Geneva Convention is especially important because it protects civilians. This is a radical normative development for states to agree to protect civilians in warfare for the first time. And the Geneva Conventions have massively expanded the scope of international humanitarian law. The Geneva Conventions have now been ratified by virtually all states, 194 states. So they have virtually universal application and are today the cornerstone of international humanitarian law. They have an impact on the ground because prisoners of war are now protected and visited by the International Committee of the Red Cross. The Red Cross, Red Crescent, and now, since 2005, Red Crystal symbols have protected a huge number of hospitals, medical personnel, and wounded, all as a result of the wide acceptance of the Geneva Conventions. And a few comments about the fourth reading, Selling Justice Short, Why Accountability Matters, was about 55 pages that I'd like people to read from this whole report of over 130 pages. If you don't have time for all of that again, just look through intro, conclusion, skim some of the most important points. And I'll mention a few of those points here. So different forms of accountability are mentioned in the report. There's legal justice, which includes domestic courts, universal jurisdiction, and international courts, such as mentioned in podcast 3, the Yugoslavia, Rwanda War Crimes Tribunals, and the International Criminal Court. But in addition to legal justice pursuit, there's also something known as Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, most famously in South Africa from 1994. But the most important thing that the article mentions is really the argued conflict between justice, that is accountability, and peace. Some people argue that you can either have accountability or peace, that you can't have both. So some argue, for example, you have to give amnesty to dictators or to those involved in a conflict to get them to end the conflict. If they don't have immunity, they'll just keep on fighting. Why should they stop fighting if they won't be protected from prosecution? However, as the report argues, amnesty effectively equals impunity, and then it means there's no deterrent effect for the future. If people realize they can constantly get away with things by creating an amnesty agreement at the end of a conflict or during a conflict, there's no incentive for them to not commit crimes in the first place. Anyway, an important point to keep in mind is that amnesty is actually illegal under international law for serious crimes. It's void. And the report argues that accountability does act effectively as a deterrent. It argues that there's increasing anecdotal evidence of warlords being concerned about prosecution, having seen others be prosecuted by the International Criminal Court and other international courts, and that therefore having accountability, while it may appear to diminish peace in the short term, actually in the long term will lead to more peace by deterring warlords from committing acts of atrocity. So that's the end of this podcast, the end of this discussion of the readings for Unit 13.